I figured about half of you hadn't been to the March presentation, so I'm going to go very quickly through the March presentation, mainly because I get to mention Captain Cook. And he's a buddy of mine. I've written a great deal about him, and so I feel the obligation to always mention Captain Cook in anything I do. So in any event, we're going to cover three main subjects today. The March recap will be quick, I promise. Then we're going to talk about territory and statehood, and this is the era before the Civil War, and it is consumed with Indian wars and the pretty unfortunate relationship that white settlers had with the Indians during that time. And then we'll move into the 1880s, and we talk about commerce and prosperity, and at the end of that, I'm going to bring you to Central Oregon and talk a little bit about how Central Oregon was first founded. So the recap is going to be quick, and this is what we covered in March. Native migration across Beringia, the Bering Land Bridge, as you may know it, and then the later settlement in the Oregon country, and the population decline that was wreaked upon the native Indian population, many of which before we had initial European contact. We'll talk a little about the initial European exploration, and then my friend Captain Cook in Vancouver and what they accomplished on the coast, the later Lewis and Clark expedition, and then the founding of Astoria and Fort Vancouver. And then, of course, as we all know, the Oregon Trail brought Americans for the first time into the region in some number. And we ended the last time with the Oregon boundary dispute. So just as a quick recollection of these things, here's the Bering Land Bridge. And as you can see, the multiple colors show you when the Ice Age occurred. Of course, the ice was on the land, and so that reduced the level of the seawater, and that allowed the Bering Strait to turn into a landward bridge, bringing the native people from Siberia into Alaska. There have been a number of theories suggested by archaeologists over the years. Principally, the feeling was that they came across the land and down into what we now know as New Mexico as being one of the principal locations of their first arrival. More recent evidence suggests that there was a coastal migration before the Ice Age, and that's important to Oregon. Because for those of you who are aware of it, at Fort Rock Cave and Paisley Cave, southeast of here, there is considerable evidence of human habitation before the Bering Land Bridge. And in fact, Paisley Caves is probably the oldest known area of human settlement in North America. So we should be pretty proud of that as Oregonians. In addition, another important aspect of the Oregon Native American history is Celilo Falls. Salmon dominated the trade networks of all the native people in this area of all the Pacific Northwest, and they tended to congregate when the salmon were there at Celilo Falls because they were fairly easy to catch despite all those huge cascades. And as we all know, that was dammed in 1959. But the important point is that for 15,000 years, it was the oldest continuously inhabited community on the North American continent. So when you think about Native Americans in Oregon, you can remember Paisley Caves being the first evidence of Native people in North America and also the oldest community in North America. As we all know, there was a significant decline in the indigenous population, which we discussed in much greater detail last time. Suffice to say that 1/3 of all Native Americans in the US were in California, and the second largest concentration was in the Pacific Northwest and British Columbia. They had a significant decline because of disease principally, but you also learn some about the Indian wars that occurred in those locations on the West Coast. The principal information from Vancouver and Lewis and Clark I thought I'd mention here is because they were the first Europeans on the coast, essentially. And they discovered that probably a third of the native people had already died from connection with other native people and merchants and the like. So it was a pretty substantial fall in population well before white settlers came to Oregon. Now, as we also discussed the maritime history, and this is, of course, the Euro-American contact. For those of you who haven't seen a recent map, our area, that is the Midwest to Alaska, was unmapped and the last to be mapped of all the major regions in the world. And the effort to get up to our area and to Alaska, where some of us in this room are from, I might add, it was quite inconsistent. The Spanish, when they first arrived in Mexico, quickly sent somebody up the California coast. In 50 years, they knew that part of California where you see the red line. And Sir Francis Drake also came to the coast and reached as far north probably as Oregon, but we don't know for sure. On the northwest coast, Drake is believed to have stayed in the area of Port Reyes National Seashore and came in contact with the Coast Miwok people. But the problem for the next 2 centuries was Spain lost interest. They were interested in gold and trading with the Philippines, and so they established these Manila galleons, huge ships by comparison to the other ships of the day, and they transited to Manila from Acapulco twice a year and carried goods back and forth. No interest in California, Oregon, or further north. What finally got the Spanish's attention was the Russians decided to find how far their country extended. And so we have Vitus Bering, who's a Dane that was hired by the Russians to search out, and he had 2 rather unimpressive voyages, but nonetheless he established that Alaska existed and where the Bering Strait was. After that, the Russians founded Alaska and did considerable amount of fur hunting and then reached even further south to Fort Ross, who many of you may have been to just north of San Francisco, and they even established a port for a short while on Kauai. With the Russians showing an interest in North America, the Spanish decided, after 2 centuries of not paying any attention, they decided also to establish colonies in southern and central California along the coast. We all know about the missions and their controversial history. I'm not going to discuss that with you today, but it was pretty considerable. And then the Spanish even went further north, as far as southeast Alaska, and established a fort at Nootka Sound on the west coast of Vancouver Island. Enter my buddy Cook. He was on his 3rd major voyage, probably the greatest maritime explorer of all time. His 3rd voyage was to look for the so-called Northwest Passage, a way to get from Europe to China without having to go through Mexico or deal with the Spanish. And Cook spent a great deal of time in the South Pacific, but then found Hawaii and then came across to Oregon. And this is essentially the first thing that was written about Oregon. If you ever want to look at Cook's journals, of course I have them, so you're welcome to come by and read about it. But in any event, the land is a moderate height, free from snow, agreeably diversified with hills and valleys extending a long way back. This is at Cape Foulweather, if you know where that is on the coast. Further north, they encounter the Nootka people, who are similar to the people who lived here in Oregon. So I wanted to show you what their homes look like, these beautiful cedar homes, and of course canoes. Cook got all the way to the north until he was stopped by the ice north of Bering Strait. Vancouver followed 15 years later. He was on Cook's ship and he came back, and boy, I'd love to tell you about Vancouver. He named just about everything that you know about, Rainier and Hood, for example. But we can't talk much about Vancouver, but he is the principal explorer of the Northwest Coast. And that's a picture of him. Believe it or not, he died at age 40. His typical way of exploring the coast was to go up inlets on camping trips, essentially. And you see on the right there a picture of a camping trip. He had his small shore boats off the ship, and they would literally row up and down every inlet along the coast in order to map the coast. And on the left is the map of our area from Oregon to north of Vancouver Island. And you can see, remember the map I showed you before where the Pacific Northwest was a blank space. Now after Cook and Vancouver, everything is well drawn, including Alaska. I have written here the origin of the name of Oregon, and I won't go through the details, but some of the origins are rather bizarre. One guy thinking that it came from the east coast of America, from the Algonquin. The most appealing one is from Shoshone words, but nonetheless, we don't exactly know where the term Oregon came from. But nonetheless, it was first popularized by Thomas Jefferson when he sent Lewis and Clark to Oregon. And I think you're generally aware of where Lewis and Clark traveled. The importance here in Oregon, it can't be understated, not only because they were the first Euro-American overland voyage or travel, but also because they established an American claim to the Pacific Northwest. Soon after Lewis and Clark, Astoria was founded. Very soon thereafter, it became British because of the War of 1812. And a series of fur hunting forts is all that existed in the Pacific Northwest at that time. Fort Vancouver was established after Astoria proved to be too rainy and the furs were hunted out. And so Fort Vancouver was established where Vancouver, Washington is today. And then, as we all know, except for Lewis and Clark, we didn't have much claim to the Pacific Northwest, we Americans. And then all of a sudden, the Oregon Trail, manifest destiny, the opportunity for free land, and Americans came in droves. I'll show you the population statistics, probably not as substantial as you might expect, but nonetheless, the Oregon Trail generated as many as 400,000 settlers by the time of the Civil War. John McLaughlin, who is the factor at Fort Vancouver for the Hudson Bay Company, in fact, abandoned the Hudson Bay Company because he wanted to support the American settlement of Oregon. And he founded Oregon City. We had a 4-year voyage to the Pacific Northwest by John Wilkes. This is an interesting, Charles Wilkes. John Wilkes was famous for something else. Wilkes was the American Captain Cook, of course, 50 years later, but he studied the Pacific Northwest and was extremely important to the American claims to this area because he studied the area and traveled the Willamette River into California, among other things, and also up into Puget Sound. So before that time, we didn't have any claim but for Lewis and Clark, and of course the arrival of the wagon trains that were coming at the same time. And it's fair to say that one of the important parts of Wilkes' expedition is his writing about the native people that existed in Oregon. That's an important resource for modern scholars to understand the native people before they were decimated in the wars and pestilence that came thereafter. So finally, after all of this, and because of the recent American incursions, when it came time to establish a treaty between the United States and Britain, Britain, of course, had a much longer contact with the area because, of course, of Cook and Vancouver and other explorers who I haven't mentioned here today. But because of the Oregon Trail and Lewis and Clark, we were able to claim half Oregon country. And after considerable discussion and a fight, you remember the 54-40 or fight rallying cry, that occurred during the 1844 presidential campaign. But in any event, James Polk decided that we'd extend the 49th parallel, and although there was a struggle over who would own Puget Sound, ultimately the United States acquired that area. So that, in a quick report, is what we covered in March. Now I want to talk to you about territory and statehood, and particularly the considerable difficulties that the Oregon populace had with the native people who already lived here. Initially, probably the most significant event to begin our story today is the Whitman Massacre. You've probably heard about it. It occurred in Walla Walla, Washington, today's Walla Walla. A group of Cayuse men who suspected that Marcus Whitman had poisoned them killed Whitman, his wife, and 11 other members of the settlement in 1847. Now, this is after Oregon Territory was part of the United States, but no territorial government had been established. This massacre is usually attributed to the inability of Whitman to prevent the measles outbreak or to cure the natives who were in his care. Meanwhile, the settlers recovered. And what's the reason for that? We can only assume that they had been exposed to measles before and probably could recover as a result of contacting it, whereas the Indians had no natural way to prevent deaths in a significant number. But the point of the massacre was that it was a decisive episode in the U.S. settlement of the Pacific because Congress finally took note of Oregon and established a territory and a territorial legislature. And the main reason, of course, was to justify sending an army to protect the white settlers. Now, in the newspapers of the East, you can imagine it was sensationalized, and here's a picture of Marcus Whitman reading a book, unknowing by the fireplace that he's about to be killed. Of course, it wasn't quite like that, but nonetheless, it was a considerable outrage when you consider that the native people were living in harmony with Whitman for years as he was a missionary in Walla Walla. This is Marcus and Narcissa Whitman and a Cayuse chief, the Cayuse being the native people who were local to the Whitman mission. On the left, the black and white, the grainy black and white picture, I think you can see that the mission is just a couple of buildings. The natives are living right next door in teepees. They were living in harmony until this problem with the measles outbreak. And today you can, of course, visit it if you'd like. It's a national park. But because of the Whitman Massacre, the Oregon Territory was established. 1848. And as you know, at the time, it included not just Oregon, but also modern Washington and Idaho, as well as parts of Wyoming and Montana. There were a number of divisions over the years, and this depicts how they were divided. Oregon, of course, became a state in 1859, 11 years later. The territory was established as a federal enclave. Everyone was appointed by the president. They had a legislature, a governor, and a Supreme Court. Taxation was pretty exciting. 0.25% property tax. Don't we wish? And you could double it if you were inside a local government boundary, so 0.5%. In addition, there was a poll tax if you wanted to vote, and merchant fees up to $60 a year for the biggest businesses. Oh, and I forgot to mention that the property tax applied to all property except for farms and farm products. So we shouldn't get ahead of ourselves imagining how many white people lived in Oregon at the time. This is a picture of Oregon City, which is by far and away the largest city in Oregon at the time. And the Capitol building to the right, called the Morrison Building in Oregon City. But we did have the first newspaper west of the Mississippi. The most significant thing that happened to Oregon, good and bad, in this early going of the territory is the California Gold Rush. I think we all know that the gold was found in 1848. There was a huge number of immigrants who came to California, 300,000, they say, in the next year. If you can imagine that, 10 times the population of the state. And it became so heavily populated that it became a state itself. For the residents of Oregon, California miners provided an important market for their agricultural and timber products. Unfortunately, that also meant that many of the people who had moved to Oregon on the wagon trains went to California to look for gold. So the population of Oregon was depleted soon after it was established as a territory. Now, the issue of indigenous communities comes up now, and I'll be referring to that for a good part of the talk, because the white reaction, particularly the gold miner reaction to the native people who lived in California, was nothing short of genocide. In the early going of the California state, the legislature actually adopted laws that paid bounties for murdering Indians. And they were repealed after 4 or 5 years, but it's a sad story about the state of California that people don't know about. Oregon did not do that. But nonetheless, these pressures were on the people of Oregon just as much. Now, after the gold rush, this is what Oregon looked like in 1850. This is, of course, the white population, not the native population. There were just 10 counties, 7 in Oregon, 3 in Washington, and a total of 13,000 souls. Pretty tiny. There were 9 churches in the whole territory. This is, again, Oregon and Washington, and Idaho for that matter. So it was a pretty Spartan existence. In order to attract some of these gold miners back to Oregon, they established the Oregon Donation Land Act of 1850. It was the most generous federal land act in American history, giving 640-acre claims, which was initially established. If you remember, we talked about how the Oregon provisional government, before the United States and Britain settled their claims, there was a provisional government established near Salem. I'm told you pronounce it Champooey and not Champeg. Champooey. But in any event, the provisional government was there at Champooey, and they established this program, and it was continued by the United States through the territorial government, and it legitimized these claims, but it left a permanent imprint on the Oregon landscape. The grid pattern that you're probably familiar with in the Willamette and Rogue Valleys, that came from the Oregon Land Donation Act. It excluded blacks and Hawaiians. Now, there were Hawaiians who came to Oregon in this time and the Pacific Northwest, but it obviously attracted a huge inrush of white settlers to the Umpqua and Rogue Valleys, as well as, of course, the Willamette Valley, many fresh from the gold fields. The out-migration from Oregon to California switched in 1855, and Californians started coming up to Oregon. 30,000 white immigrants arrived in Oregon, and 7,000 made claims to 2.5 million acres of land. So during the Oregon Territory, this is a considerable change in the landscape of Oregon. And Oregon's white population moved to 60,000 souls by 1860, which is the time of statehood. In the midst of all of this, despite these low populations, the people in Washington wanted to be a separate territory. When they did this, the Oregon legislature didn't seem to mind, and so they permitted them to separate. And as you can see, the boundaries are rather oblong compared to what we're used to today, because all Oregon and part of Montana all of Idaho and part of Montana are included in the respective boundaries. Even before white settlers entered Southern Oregon, miners began prospecting. And the prospecting miners, of course, were probably from California, looking for gold opportunities. And they were bringing with them their attitudes about the Native Americans. And so they fought regularly with the natives, kicked them out of their lands whenever their lands happened to be involved with either mining or later agriculture. And so the federal government appointed Joel Palmer as superintendent of Indian Affairs to negotiate treaties with these Indian bands. Now, his uniform approach was get out of the way of the white people. So the treaties that he established with the native people was, you have to move away. And he would negotiate the treaties in 1852, and then the miners would find something new in 1853, and then he'd have to move the natives further away. It was a pretty disappointing experience. And whenever the treaties went back to Congress for ratification, Congress didn't take any action. And presumably because they knew that the natives would be pushed further and further away from areas that were attractive to white people. And we have drawings at the time. In this time, there was an army presence in Oregon, but much of the enforcement of these treaties fell upon vigilantes, and you can imagine they weren't very friendly to the native people. So warfare was a pretty obvious outcome. In the Rogue River Wars, which are the first of several wars that occurred in Oregon, these bouts of violence increased until the hostilities broke out. Now Oregon is still a territory in 1854. One group of native people returned to their old village because they couldn't stand the lands that they had been provided by treaty, and then a volunteer militia attacked them and killed 23 men, women, and children. The Indians fled downriver and were confronted by more volunteers, and there were more attacks and assaults. As a result, there were more attacks, more skirmishes. There's a considerable story here. I'm going to mention to you several different wars that occurred in Oregon, and I would encourage you to look into them if you're interested in this pretty dismal period in Oregon history. The long and short of it is, of course, the U.S. Army had the advantage. And when the U.S. Army was here in force, and they came in force, the hostilities ceased, and most bands surrendered and were sent away to newly established reservations. This is the first time that the reservation system was established in Oregon. I think we all know about the reservation system, but they established the Siletz and Grand Ronde reservations. This is a pretty crummy map, but you can see Jacksonville in the lower right, and most of the fighting in the Rogue River Wars were between Jacksonville and the coast, Gold Beach and the like. And these were where the skirmishes occurred, and you can just imagine that the native people had already been pushed out of their preferred lands and were fighting to just get back to lands that they could survive in. This famous guy is very important to the natives of Southern Oregon because he was a resistance fighter, you know, the Che Guevara of his time, I suppose. So the point is, the U.S. government finally decided, Joel Palmer, the fellow we introduced to you a little earlier, that reservations were going to be the only way that we could stave off this constant fighting and skirmishing between the natives and the white people who came to dominate the region, both in the Willamette Valley and the Rogue Valley. And because of all of these skirmishes, the treaties that were established by Palmer at this time were finally ratified by Congress because they were realizing that they had to draw the line and keep the white people from occupying all the lands that the natives wanted to go to. But in the end, dozens of bands, some of them arch rivals, were confederated into these reservations, some of them, of course, very far from their traditional homelands. The picture here is simply to reflect on the traditional homelands before contact with white people on the left, and where the established reservations of today existed. Most of these reservations were established in the 1850s. To the extent you haven't already guessed, the legacy is a little unhappy. There was an original coastal reservation that had been established by Palmer, then he divided it up a great deal to get the Siletz and Grand Ronde reservations. And annual deaths in these reservations usually exceeded birth rates until the early 20th century. And I give you some numbers here, but you can see that the statistics are pretty grim. I mentioned the Warm Springs Reservation because we don't think of it, but at this time, there weren't many white people over here east of the Cascades, but nonetheless, there were enough running around that the tribal area was greatly reduced to 1,000 square miles, but that is the largest of all the reservations, Warm Springs. And a fair summary on this page of the Indian reservations that we have today. Most of the early written record of Native people was from the white person's perspective because they had the power of the pen, and they had a very biased perspective generally. And so native histories, the native people weren't well considered at the time. These traditions changed greatly when they relocated into the reservations. And of course, today, native historians and other scholars are generally committed to narrating a history that remembers the ancient traditions and is honest, accurate, and revealing of longstanding native culture. And I would add that your speaker in a month will be someone who can speak to this directly. And when I close my presentation today, I'll talk to you a little about Diane Tiemann. So in the face of all of this turmoil, the territory of Oregon decides they want a constitutional convention and become a state. For 2 years, the legislature refused, but finally in 1856, and timely, this is when after the reservations were established, the legislature passed a bill authorizing a convention to establish a constitution, which is the precursor to statehood. The voters approved it. Note the vote total. We're still a pretty tiny place. 7,200 in favor of holding a convention and 1,600 opposed. 60 people met in 1857, and you can see their composition. A few lawyers, thank goodness for lawyers, right? Who agrees with me? The principal debate revolves around slavery. And now remember where we are in American history. This is just before the Civil War. And the decision of the folks who attended the convention was to exclude blacks, as if Oregon could avoid the slavery question by preventing racial minorities from entering the state. In other words, the Constitutional Convention approved a document that prevented blacks and, oh, by the way, Chinese from entering the state. Female suffrage was discussed, but women were also denied the right to vote. So then they had a vote on the convention, vote of white men over 21, by the way, 7,100 for, 3,200 against. I guess it's time to talk about racism in Oregon. I mean, we've talked a lot about the difficulties that the white settlers had with the native community, but there were a tremendous number of white supremacist hate groups in Oregon at the time, also in California and Washington, I might add. Kind of odd when you consider our history today, but there was common occurrences of discrimination against Native African, Mexican, Hawaiian, and folks of Asian descent. Much of this is attributed to the California gold rush. You can imagine the difficulties that they had in that environment, but it was brought back to Oregon by the people who came back from California. At the time the Constitution was written, some people tried to get these attitudes adjusted. The vote on slavery was small, 2,600 in favor and 7,700 to make it illegal. But then they wanted to vote to prevent blacks from living in the state. And that passed by an even more overwhelming margin. And this last sentence on this is probably very important. One of the things I hope you take away from this lecture. When Oregon was admitted in 1859, now understand this is moments before the Civil War broke out, Oregon was the only state to enter the Union with a black exclusion law. No other state's done that before or since. The racism continued, obviously during the Civil War. In 1862, all people of Black, Chinese, Hawaiian, or mixed descent were taxed $5, which is a considerable sum at the time, as you might imagine. If not paid, they could be whipped or forcibly removed from the state. Interracial marriage was, of course, outlawed, and white people couldn't even marry Chinese or Hawaiians, or Native Americans for that matter. This is an interesting statistic about the 14th and 15th Amendment. We consider ourselves to be, have embraced the side of the North on the Civil War, but in 1868, the 14th Amendment was adopted, giving citizenship to Black people. Oregon ratified the 14th Amendment in 1866. Remember, you have to have so many states ratify for an amendment to be adopted as part of the Constitution. But then they rescinded their ratification 2 years later. And believe it or not, we didn't ratify it again until 1973. The 15th Amendment, which prohibited denying the right of vote to racial minorities and former slaves, also gained widespread ratification by the states, but Oregon was one of 8 states to reject it. How about that? We can assume the southern states didn't even, the southern states being under Reconstruction probably were not rejecting it, but Oregon did. It was not until 1959 that Oregon would ratify the 15th Amendment. Sorry to disappoint you about our lovely state, but this is our history. The Wild West, yes. So Oregon was established in 1859. The request for statehood was denied several times, principally because the question was whether Oregon would be a slave state or a non-slave state, a free, so-called free state, and they agreed to allow Oregon to enter as a free state because they opened slavery in the southwestern United States. And this is before the Civil War, when Arizona and New Mexico were allowed to be included as slave states. And so that's the reason that we are admitted as a non-slave state. But remember, Oregon has this constitutional provision that blacks aren't allowed, and that was the way Oregon decided that they could resolve this pre-Civil War conundrum. Soon after we became a state, of course, the Civil War broke out. And the little bit of army that we had here, and remember, the army was the one that fought the Rogue Wars and established the reservations and enforced the reservations, they vanished. They went back east to fight the Civil War. And so it was now up to a volunteer cavalry, one step maybe above vigilantism, that protected settlers from Indian attacks and otherwise kept the peace. This is part of the group that established Camp Polk here. As you might remember, the Santiam Wagon Road had just started, and they wanted to protect white settlers coming into Central Oregon. But after a year here, there were no skirmishes, there was no trouble, and so they went elsewhere. Now, elsewhere they needed to go because there were a considerable number of native troubles. And since I see that I'm getting close to wanting to finish, I'm going to go through these a little quicker than you probably would like, but there were massacres and skirmishes after the state was established. And remember, the enforcement was no longer by the Army until the Civil War was over. This Salmon Falls massacre was an Indian massacre of an Oregon wagon train, which started the Snake War. Now, the Snake War is up near the Snake River in northeastern Oregon. And it wasn't resolved until the U.S. Army Commander George Crook came back from the Civil War. You've heard these names? Paulina and Crook. They're famous here because of these snake wars. We had a very important battle at the Wye River that was Paulina's end, and Cook again found him at Steens Mountain, and he was killed there, and then the matter was resolved. And that was about the end of the Indian War in the Snake River area, but 1,762 men were known to have died, which is one of the largest wars, Indian wars that occurred in the western United States. Crook went on, by the way, to lead attacks on the Apache and captured Geronimo. The Modoc War, now we're in southeast Oregon and into California. Once again, trouble with the reservations. The natives couldn't handle the reservations. They wanted to leave the reservations. This is a problem that the Modoc and the Klamath, who were in the same reservation, were rivals, and they couldn't get along. And once again, tremendous warfare, and the native principals were hanged. And last but not least, probably the most famous of all the wars in our region is the flight of the Nez Perce. The Nez Perce were originally told to go into the Umatilla Reservation, the little one over here to the left. Then they were allowed to have a larger reservation, that you see in green. But then gold miners came into Idaho and insisted that the Nez Perce be confined in a much smaller reservation. So they were put into this reservation, which is now in Idaho, the much smaller one that you see within the green. The story of the Nez Perce, of course, is the story of non-treaty band led by Chief Joseph, who left northeastern Oregon and traveled across to attempt to come in contact with a Sitting Bull. Sitting Bull had moved to Canada and was given solace there, and so Joseph decided to go join him, but all the American army chased after him and stopped him before he reached Canada. This is the so-called flight of the Nez Perce you see in red, starting in Oregon and leading all the way through Yellowstone National Park and then traveling north. They got within 40 miles of the Canadian border when they were captured. And although they were promised that they would be able to return to, in order for them to give up, they were promised they could go back to the reservation in Idaho, but instead 400 people, including women and children, were taken prisoner and sent by train to Fort Leavenworth. Pretty sad story in American history. So, with the last 10 minutes, I'm going to talk to you about a little more happy circumstances. With the native question now resolved, the people of Oregon could now face, the white people of Oregon, I might add, could now face a more prosperous future, and it was prosperous. The principal reason for Oregon's growth was the railroad. In the 1870s and 1880s, the railroad was critical to marketing the state's lumber and wheat. As you remember, the first transcontinental railroad came to California in 1869. Then the Oregon and California Railroad, which you see in red, connects Portland to California. And so whatever is going south goes not just to California, but also can go east. And of course, in 1883, two different northern railways reached Seattle and Tacoma. the railroad was considerably different than what we've experienced today. Look at the trestles on the edge of the Columbia River. How that stood, I don't know. But in any event, these are the railroads that served Oregon and turned it into an economic powerhouse. There was a bit of fraud along the way that I mentioned here. A lot of the land sales were made not to settlers, but to people who were sitting in the bars in Portland. And that's the way they sold their land so that they could get much of it into private hands. Steamships were also very important. As you might imagine, the railroads needed to connect to the rivers, and these steamships were a very important aspect of it. And for a period of time, particularly during the Civil War, they were extremely profitable. And then the railroads soon took them over. This is an interesting early picture of Portland and steamships up and down the Willamette River. The result of all this commerce was the rise of Portland. As you can see, in 1850, there wasn't much to it, and you can see the picture to show that. By 1860, 2,800 people, and by the turn of the century, 90,000 people. Remember, Portland was bigger than Seattle at this time. And so this is a depiction of Portland in 1890, and this interesting colorized version of downtown Portland in 1898. Other aspects to the commerce of Oregon that are important to mention are agriculture. The growth of agriculture was just phenomenal. 200,000 bushels of wheat in 1850, tripled by 1860, 2 million by 1870, and it grew 400% in the following decade. Just huge increases, principally because they could now sell it nationwide. And the mechanism, I don't know how many of you are familiar with agriculture and the mechanization of agriculture, but back in the 19th century, it was all horses. Timber, similarly. During the period of the gold rush, it was easily accessible timber along the coast and in the Willamette Valley. And then because of railroads, they could reach more isolated timber. And the Midwest did have timber, but it was all gone by this time. So Oregon became the mainstay. They had what they called a donkey engine. If any of you are familiar with the history of timber, this is a very important addition to timber harvests in this era. At the same time, we had salmon canning, which was an extremely important part of the growing economy in Oregon. Unfortunately, we over-harvested. For those of us who now live or used to live in Alaska, but are familiar with Alaska, these darn fish wheels take everything, and then there are no salmon left to come back for the future. Notice Scandinavian Packing Company. So the Chinese question. We now have a new problem. And that is the Chinese, who principally came to build the railroads in California, moved to Oregon, and they were like the other minorities before them. There was a great deal of opposition to them, particularly during economic downturns when people felt that they were taking their jobs. Sounds familiar maybe with today's activity. There was a Chinese must-go fervor. It first reached the states of California, Oregon, and Washington, and then there was a Congress adopted a Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. As the Chinese gradually withdrew, then the Japanese arrived. They had the same problem. But interestingly, the Scandinavians came to principally work in the fishing industry. And maybe because they weren't competing with whites, who were already here, there was not much resistance to the Scandinavians. So now I want to conclude with a discussion of Central Oregon. And I hope you'll add, when we ask questions, if you'll add to some thoughts about this, because my information is pretty limited, but I'd like to know more. We discussed it in March, how Central Oregon was initially the home to indigenous groups, principally the Northern Paiute. We had a number of frontiersmen who surveyed the region. The first community was Prineville in 1868, started as a road ranch by Barney and Elizabeth Prine. And here's a tidbit I hope you all know, but just in case you don't, Sisters was second in 1888. So long before any other communities that you're aware of in Central Oregon, Sisters was second, and I'll explain why. But the reason that Central Oregon finally grew is because of the arrival of railroads and irrigation management, which allowed the farms to prosper. The principal route to reach Central Oregon was the Santiam Wagon Road. And it was constructed during and after the Civil War and operated as a toll road until 1915. Imagine hundreds of 4- and 6-horse teams pulling wagon trains, some a half-mile long, loaded with wool from eastern Oregon, headed to the mills in the Willamette Valley. And then they would return with fruit, vegetables, and other supplies, and cattle. Now, this is the route. And featured on this route is where we live. The Willamette Valley, Lebanon, is to the left. And of course, Prineville is center right. But in between are the number of locations here in our region. The Cache Creek toll station is essentially where Black Butte is today. So that's how you entered the toll road. And so you can imagine why Sisters, being so close, being close to where Camp Polk was, became critical to the development of the area. A little history about Bend. It was named Farewell Bend by a Midwesterner who fought in the Mexican War. He obtained a land claim, and because Farewell Bend was already in use, the post office called it Bend. And at the turn of the century, there were commercial sawmills constructed, and at Mirror Pond, the town's first irrigation and electricity. So you all know where Mirror Pond is, next to downtown Bend. There were 2 very large timber mills constructed in 1915. This, by the way, is Bend in the 1890s and one of the initial timber operations. And of course, we're familiar with the lumber mills that existed in Bend that now are a popular shopping center. These are believed to be the largest mills in America for a considerable period. In Sisters, we know that Camp Polk was abandoned in 1866. Then in 1888, the post office moved to a store owned by this fellow, John Smith. He wanted to name the post office Three Sisters, and just like they did in Bend, they shortened it to Sisters. So the post office named both Bend and Sisters. The early growth is attributed to the Sandiam Wagon Road and sheep traffic and later cattle traffic. The toll station is, as I told you, at Black Butte Ranch, in the area of Black Butte Ranch. But Sisters was the only town between the Cascades and Prineville was the principal community. In the mid-1880s, the area had about 20 families. It was platted again at the turn of the century, just like Bend, and we now have they established the street layout that we have today. Cattle replaced sheep as the principal industry, and then logging came later on, and the last mill closed in 1963. So that's downtown Sisters. You recognize the hotel on the right, I'm sure. And this is a little bit later, about the 1920s. Sisters and the Hotel Sisters again is prominent. And this is the first timber mill in Sisters. So with that, I'm now concluded. Hour and 5 minutes, sorry about that. I'm concluding with this slide to introduce you to our next speaker and to also mention this rather sordid Native history that we've talked about today. The Oregon Historical Quarterly, the current version on the left, is the story of Central Oregon and particularly the Paiute people. And I commend to your attention getting a hold of that. If you know anybody who's a member of the Historical Society, I don't know if they sell them on the newsstands, but this is a really interesting book that talks about the Native people of this region. And as you can see in this drawing of the three sisters, the Native people were prominent in this region. In fact, for me, when they talk about what to put on the roundabout, I would have a Native theme and not, since the Native people have been in this region for 14,000 years and not 200. But Diane will talk about that. Diane Tiemann is the former chair of the Northern Paiute community in Bend, and she's also an archaeologist, and that's a pretty interesting combination. And I think you'll be very intrigued by her discussion. And I'd encourage you all to learn a bit more about our Native American heritage here in Central Oregon. Okay, thank you.